Imagine being born into royalty, destined for a fairy tale life. Imagine palaces of gold, servants at your command, and a future as bright as the crown jewels themselves. Now imagine that dream turning into a nightmare you couldn't escape. A nightmare that would span 8 decades and 2 world wars. Princess Stephanie of Belgium should have lived the life we see in storybooks. Instead, she was betrayed by the man who vowed to love her, infected with diseases that stole her future, widowed by suicide, trapped in exile, and ultimately estranged from her only child. Her husband's infidelity didn't just break her heart, it destroyed her body, leaving her infertile at just 22 years old. And that was only the beginning of her suffering. She would survive typhus as a child, syphilis and gonorrhea as a young woman, 2 world wars as an adult, and witness the deaths of nearly everyone she had ever loved. She would defy emperors, lose her titles, and die in exile, unmourned by her own daughter. This is the tragic story of the infected princess, a story of survival that raises a haunting question. Is survival always the victory we think it is? On May 21st, 1864, Princess Stephanie Clotilde Louise Hermione Marie Charlotte was born in the Laeken Palace on the outskirts of Brussels, Belgium. The palace itself was a monument to power, a neoclassical masterpiece surrounded by vast gardens, greenhouses filled with exotic plants, and grounds that seemed to stretch forever. Her father was Prince Leopold, Duke of Brabant, and heir to the Belgian throne. Her mother was Marie Henriette of Austria, an archduchess from the powerful Habsburg family. Stephanie was their 3rd child, arriving after her older brother Leopold and sister Louise. When Stephanie was just 18 months old, her grandfather, King Leopold I, died, and her father ascended the throne as King Leopold II. Overnight, little Stephanie became a princess of a reigning monarch. To the world, Leopold II was a visionary, a king who made tiny Belgium matter on the global stage. He commissioned grand public works, built magnificent buildings, established museums and parks. He wanted Belgium to be seen as a great European power, not just a small nation squeezed between larger neighbors. But here's what they didn't advertise in the newspapers and official portraits. Leopold's wealth came soaked in blood. In 1885, Leopold II acquired the Congo Free State, a territory in Central Africa 76 times the size of Belgium itself. He claimed it was for humanitarian purposes, to bring civilization and end the slave trade. The reality was infinitely more sinister. Leopold turned the Congo into his personal kingdom, his private property. He enslaved millions on rubber plantations and ivory collecting expeditions. Indigenous Congolese people were forced to meet impossible rubber quotas under threat of mutilation, torture, and death. Villages that didn't meet their quotas had their hands cut off, men, women, even children. Entire communities were decimated. Disease, famine, and systematic violence caused the population to plummet catastrophically. Historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, somewhere between 1 and 15 million Congolese people died under Leopold's brutal regime. The exact number may never be known. The Belgian royal fortune? Built on Congolese blood money. The magnificent palaces, the art collections, the lavish lifestyle. All of it financed by unimaginable human suffering thousands of miles away. So Stephanie's privileged life, the silk dresses, the servants, the finest education, came at an unspeakable cost. A cost she likely never fully understood as a child growing up in golden rooms, sheltered from the horrors that funded her existence. Her mother, Marie Henriette of Austria, came from one of Europe's most powerful families. She was an accomplished horsewoman, intelligent and cultured. But her marriage to Leopold was purely political, a union designed to strengthen ties between Belgium and the Habsburg Empire. The problem? They had absolutely nothing in common. Leopold was cold, calculating, obsessed with political power and colonial expansion. Marie Henriette loved horses, music, and the countryside. She was warm where he was frigid, passionate where he was indifferent. Together, they had 4 children, but their marriage was a disaster from the start. As the years passed, they could barely stand to be in the same room. By the 1870s, Marie Henriette spent most of her time away from Brussels at the country estate of Spa, where she could ride her beloved horses and escape the suffocating atmosphere of the royal court. The royal household was cold, loveless, and about to get much worse. Tragedy struck early in Stephanie's life, the kind of tragedy that would foreshadow a lifetime of loss. In January 1869, when Stephanie was only 4.5 years old, her 9-year-old brother Leopold, the heir to the throne, the son on whom all hopes rested, died after falling into a pond. Some accounts say he fell through thin ice. Others suggest he was pushed by his older sister during a childish argument, though this was never confirmed. Regardless of how it happened, the result was devastating. The entire royal household plunged into mourning. The boy who was supposed to carry on the dynasty was gone. King Leopold II became even more withdrawn and bitter. Marie Henriette's grief was inconsolable, and their already fragile marriage began to crumble completely. Young Stephanie, just a child herself, watched as her family fell apart around her. The palace, already cold, became a tomb of silence and sorrow. Then in 1871, disaster struck again. Europe in the 1870s was a dangerous place. Deadly diseases swept through cities with terrifying regularity. Typhus, smallpox, cholera, known as the Blue Death, because victims' skin turned blue from lack of oxygen. These diseases didn't discriminate between peasant and princess. When they struck, they killed indiscriminately. In the spring of 1871, an outbreak of typhus swept through Brussels, and 6-year-old Stephanie fell gravely ill. For weeks, she drifted between life and death. The fever burned so hot that servants placed ice around her small body to try to cool her down. She was unconscious for days, her breathing shallow, her pulse weak. Doctors were summoned from across Europe, but in those days, there was little they could do except wait and pray. Her family prepared for the worst. Her mother kept vigil by her bedside night after night, barely sleeping. Her father, though outwardly composed, feared losing another child so soon after his son's death. But somehow, incredibly, Stephanie survived. She was one of the lucky ones. Many children who contracted typhus in that era didn't make it. But Stephanie pulled through, though the illness left her weakened and vulnerable for months afterward. Perhaps she should have seen it then that survival would come at a cost, that suffering would follow her like a shadow for the rest of her life, that she was destined to endure, to outlast, to survive what would break others. But survival and happiness are not the same thing. By 1875, 11-year-old Stephanie found herself thrust into an unusual position. Her older sister Louise had married Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and left Brussels for Germany. Her mother, still grieving and unhappy, was rarely at the palace anymore, preferring to stay at Spa with her horses. This meant that Stephanie often found herself as the highest-ranking female royal at court, a child performing the duties of a queen consort at state dinners, official ceremonies, and diplomatic receptions. It was a heavy burden for such young shoulders. She was educated rigorously in multiple languages: French, German, English, Italian, Hungarian. She studied history, geography, music, painting, and the social graces required of a princess. Her tutors were strict disciplinarians who showed little warmth or affection. Mistakes were not tolerated. Perfection was expected. She was being groomed for something. She just didn't know what yet. But the European royal families had plans for Princess Stephanie, and those plans would seal her fate. In the winter of 1878, Stephanie's fate was sealed, though at the time it probably seemed like a fairy tale coming true. She was just 14 years old when she was introduced to Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth, and heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, one of the great powers of Europe. Rudolph was 20 years old, a full 6 years older than Stephanie. He was handsome, well-educated, liberal-minded, and by all accounts charming when he wanted to be. He spoke multiple languages, loved music and literature, and had a keen interest in science and natural history. To a 14-year-old girl raised in a cold, loveless household, Rudolph must have seemed like a dream come true. But this meeting was no accident, and romance had nothing to do with it. Behind the scenes, diplomatic negotiations were already well underway. The Habsburgs needed an heir to secure the succession. Rudolph was the only son, and there was enormous pressure on him to marry and produce male children. The Austrian court was looking for a suitable bride, someone from a respectable royal house, someone young enough to bear many children, someone who could be molded into an Austrian archduchess. King Leopold II saw an opportunity. Marrying his daughter to the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would elevate Belgium's prestige enormously. It would create a powerful alliance and secure Belgium's position in European politics. The Austrians saw Stephanie as suitable breeding stock. Nothing more, nothing less. She was young, healthy, from good royal lineage through her mother's Habsburg connections. She would do. Stephanie had no say in the matter. No one asked if she wanted this. No one cared about her feelings or her dreams. This was business, this was duty, this was what princesses were for. After that first meeting, negotiations continued for nearly 2 years. Marriage contracts were drawn up. Dowries were discussed. Religious matters were settled. Stephanie would have to convert from Catholicism to accept the specific rites of the Austrian court. 2 months later, on May 10th, 1881, just days before her 17th birthday, Stephanie and Rudolph were married in a grand ceremony in Vienna. The world saw glittering royalty, magnificent celebration, streets lined with cheering crowds. Newspapers across Europe ran glowing accounts of the fairy tale wedding. The imperial chapel was filled with the most powerful people in Europe. Stephanie wore a gown of white silk and silver thread, with a train that required 6 attendants to carry. Rudolph wore his military uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth presided over the ceremony with imperial dignity. It must have seemed for a brief moment like all those childhood fairy tales were coming true. But beneath the spectacle, darkness was already gathering. Because Rudolph of Austria was not the prince charming he appeared to be. At first, their relationship was cordial, maybe even somewhat happy. Rudolph could be charming and attentive when he wanted to be. They went on honeymoon to Laxenburg, a palace outside Vienna. For a few weeks, Stephanie might have believed this would work, but cracks appeared quickly. Rudolph had a volatile, unstable personality that he'd hidden during their courtship. He suffered from dramatic mood swings, periods of manic energy followed by deep depression. He drank heavily, starting in the morning and continuing throughout the day. And he had violent outbursts that terrified Stephanie. More than that, Stephanie found herself trapped in the palace, constantly watched by her mother-in-law, Empress Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, with almost no freedom. Every movement was monitored, every action was reported back to the emperor. She couldn't even write letters home without them being read first. This wasn't a marriage, it was a prison. The Austrian court was rigid, formal, suffocating. Everything had to be done according to centuries-old protocol. Stephanie, who had been raised in the relatively relaxed Belgian court, found herself drowning in rules and expectations. And Rudolf? Rudolf was rarely there. He spent his time with his military friends, drinking and carousing, leaving his teenage bride alone in the palace night after night. The Austrian court was rigid, formal, suffocating. Everything had to be done according to centuries-old protocol. Stephanie, who had been raised in the relatively relaxed Belgian court, found herself drowning in rules and expectations. And Rudolf was rarely there. He spent his time with his military friends, drinking and carousing, leaving his teenage bride alone in the palace night after night. And then came the devastating news that would change everything. Elizabeth Marie would be their only child, forever. Because by the mid-1880s, Stephanie was sterile, unable to have children. At just 22 years old, her reproductive system was destroyed. And the cause? Her own husband? Rudolf wasn't just an alcoholic. He was a serial philanderer, engaging in affairs with women across Vienna. Actresses, singers, aristocrats, prostitutes. He was reckless, indiscriminate, and careless. And in the process, he contracted multiple sexually transmitted diseases. Historians and medical experts who have studied the case agree that Rudolf likely passed both syphilis and gonorrhea to his wife. These were diseases with no cure in the 1880s. They caused excruciating pain, chronic inflammation, and in Stephanie's case, permanent damage to her reproductive organs. At first, doctors blamed peritonitis, inflammation of the abdominal lining. Rudolf had kept his diseases secret. And in that era, women were often blamed for reproductive problems. It took time for the truth to emerge. But by the time Stephanie learned what had really happened, it was too late. The infections had already done their damage. Her fallopian tubes were scarred beyond repair. Her uterus was compromised. She would never bear another child. At first, doctors blamed peritonitis, inflammation of the abdominal lining. Rudolf had kept his diseases secret, and in that era, women were often blamed for reproductive problems. It took time for the truth to emerge. But by the time Stephanie learned what had really happened, it was too late. The infections had already done their damage. Her fallopian tubes were scarred beyond repair. Her uterus was compromised. She would never bear another child. It was unbearable. Consumed by resentment and hurt, Stephanie refused to share a bed with Rudolf anymore. The physical side of their marriage was over. She couldn't risk further infection, further pain, and honestly, she couldn't stand to let him touch her. But Rudolf didn't care. He would stumble home at dawn reeking of alcohol and other women's perfume while she lay awake in her separate bedroom, humiliated and hurting. By the late 1880s, it was common knowledge at court that Stephanie would never have another child. Whispers followed her through the palace corridors, pitying glances, barely concealed contempt from those who saw her as a failure. And Rudolf's affairs? They continued as if nothing had happened. In fact, they got worse. He no longer even tried to hide them. He flaunted his mistresses, bringing them to parties, showering them with gifts, treating them with more affection than he had ever shown his own wife. Stephanie endured it all. What choice did she have? But the worst was still to come. Among Rudolph's many mistresses, one became particularly prominent in 1888, Baroness Mary Viscera. Mary was 17 years old, barely more than a child, when she caught the 30-year-old crown prince's attention. She came from an aristocratic family, though not one of the highest rank. She was beautiful, naive, and infatuated with the crown prince in the way only a teenager can be. Rudolph, for his part, seemed equally infatuated. Or perhaps he just liked the idea of someone who worshipped him unconditionally, who saw him as romantic and tragic, rather than dissolute and disappointing. During this time, Rudolph's behavior grew even more erratic. His drinking intensified. His mood swings became more extreme. He had always been interested in death and suicide, even as a young man. But now those interests took on an obsessive quality. Medical historians believe his worsening syphilis was affecting his brain by this point, causing the neurological and psychological symptoms that often appear in the disease's later stages: paranoia, depression, erratic behavior, poor judgment. Rudolph and Mary began spending most of their time at Mayerling, a secluded hunting lodge about 15 miles southwest of Vienna. Rudolph had purchased it years earlier and converted it into a private retreat away from the stifling atmosphere of the imperial court. It was isolated, surrounded by forest, away from prying eyes. The perfect place for an affair, or as it turned out, for something far darker. On the evening of January 29, 1889, Rudolph and Mary arrived at Mayerling together. Rudolph told his staff he wasn't to be disturbed. He and Mary dined alone in his private chambers. The next morning, January 30th, when servants tried to wake the crown prince for a planned hunting expedition, there was no response from his room. The door was locked from the inside. Growing concerned, Rudolph's valet and a hunting companion broke down the door. They found both Rudolph and Mary dead. Mary lay on the bed, shot through the head. Rudolph sat slumped in a chair nearby, a revolver in his hand, also shot through the head. Blood everywhere. The smell of gunpowder still in the air. The scene was immediately secured. Messengers were dispatched to Vienna. Within hours, Emperor Franz Joseph learned that his only son, the heir to the empire, was dead. Stephanie received the shocking news later that morning. She was 24 years old and suddenly a widow. The Mayerling incident, as it became known, sparked an immediate investigation and countless rumors that persist to this day. Was it really suicide, or was Rudolph assassinated because of his liberal political views? Were there hidden conspirators? Was Mary killed by someone else and Rudolph framed? Did they make a suicide pact? Or did Rudolph murder Mary and then kill himself? The Habsburg court moved quickly to control the narrative. Rudolph's body was removed from Mayerling within hours. Mary's body was smuggled out secretly and buried in a nearby cemetery with minimal ceremony. The emperor ordered the lodge to be stripped of furniture and evidence. The official investigation concluded it was a murder-suicide. Rudolph shot Mary first, then himself. This explanation fit the physical evidence and Rudolph's known fascination with death and suicide. But because suicide was considered a mortal sin in Catholicism, the Church initially refused to give Rudolph a proper burial. Emperor Franz Joseph had to petition the Pope directly, arguing that Rudolph had been mentally unstable, essentially insane, at the time of his death. Only then was Rudolph allowed a full state funeral. The scandal rocked Europe. Newspapers were forbidden from speculating, but everyone talked about it anyway. The heir to one of Europe's great empires had killed himself and his teenage mistress in a sordid affair. It was shocking, tragic, and deeply embarrassing to the Habsburg dynasty. For years, conspiracy theories swirled. Some claimed Rudolf was killed by French agents because of his political leanings. Others said Hungarian nationalists assassinated him. Some believed Mary's family had him killed to avenge their daughter's honor. But as more evidence emerged and more documents were released over the decades, the truth became clear. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Rudolf, in the grip of alcoholism, syphilis, and deep depression, had convinced his young mistress to die with him. And when the moment came, he shot her first, then turned the gun on himself. Curiously, in the letter Rudolf left for Stephanie, he expressed some affection and regret. He acknowledged, in his own way, the pain he had caused her. But words on paper couldn't undo years of betrayal, infection, humiliation, and abandonment. Rudolf's impact on Stephanie's life had been devastating in every possible way. He had infected her with diseases that destroyed her body. He had humiliated her with countless affairs. He had made her life at court unbearable. And now, in death, he had created a scandal that would follow her forever. At just 24 years old, Stephanie was a widow, infected, infertile, and utterly alone in a foreign court that had never truly accepted her. And her suffering was far from over. After Rudolf's death, Stephanie wanted desperately to go home to Belgium, to leave Vienna and all its painful memories behind, to take her daughter and start over somewhere, anywhere else. But there was a problem that would trap her for years to come. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie was a Habsburg archduchess. She was Austrian imperial royalty, and the Habsburg court, led by Emperor Franz Joseph, absolutely refused to let her leave Vienna. They had lost the crown prince. They weren't about to lose his daughter too, even if she was only a girl. Stephanie, now the dowager crown princess, was trapped. She could leave if she wanted, but only if she abandoned her daughter. And despite everything she had suffered, despite how much she wanted to escape, she couldn't bring herself to do that. So she stayed in Vienna, in a city where she was utterly unwanted. Her in-laws turned their backs on her. Empress Elizabeth, who had never been particularly warm to Stephanie even before Rudolf's death, now viewed her as a painful reminder of her son's scandal and suicide. Emperor Franz Joseph treated her with cold, formal politeness and nothing more. The wider court followed their lead. Stephanie was invited to fewer events. She was seated in less prominent positions at state dinners. She was quietly, systematically isolated. She lived in a grace and favor apartment in the palace, neither quite in the imperial family nor quite out of it. A ghost haunting the corridors of her own former life. During this lonely, painful time, she found an unexpected source of comfort. Count Arthur Potocki, a Polish nobleman who served in the Austrian diplomatic corps. Arthur had been a friend to both Rudolf and Stephanie before Rudolf's death. Unlike most people at court, he didn't abandon Stephanie after the scandal. Instead, he stood by her through the darkest days of her mourning and isolation. Over time, comfort became companionship, and companionship became something deeper. For the first time since her teenage marriage to Rudolf, Stephanie felt genuine affection, maybe even love. Arthur wanted to marry her. Stephanie wanted to say yes. Finally, she might have a chance at happiness. But fate wasn't finished with her yet. In 1889, Arthur Potocki was diagnosed with tongue cancer. In that era, cancer treatment was primitive and often more harmful than the disease itself. Still, doctors attempted surgery, hoping to remove the tumor. The surgery failed catastrophically. It left Arthur unable to speak, in constant pain, his face and throat mutilated. For months, he suffered horribly, while Stephanie watched helplessly, caring for him as best she could. By March 1890, Arthur was dead. He was still under 40 years old. Stephanie, still grieving Rudolph's violent suicide just a year earlier, was plunged into mourning once again. But this time, the grief was different. This time, she mourned not a man who had destroyed her, but one who had shown her kindness and love when she desperately needed it. To escape her sorrows and the suffocating atmosphere of Vienna, Stephanie began to travel extensively. She went to the Mediterranean, to Malta, to Tunisia, to Sicily, to Corfu. She drifted from place to place, searching for distraction, relief, or perhaps just a reason to keep going. Her travelogues from this period, written years later, have a haunted quality to them. She describes beautiful landscapes and ancient ruins, but there's an emptiness to it all. She was running from ghosts that followed her wherever she went. Meanwhile, back in Belgium, King Leopold II had other plans for his daughter. He saw an opportunity to secure another political alliance. The new heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph. Leopold wanted Stephanie to marry Franz Ferdinand, thus reinstating her position as future empress. It was the same game he'd played with her first marriage, using his daughter as a political pawn to advance Belgium's interests. But Stephanie had had enough of political marriages. She refused. Flatly, definitively refused. She was done being used. She was done sacrificing herself for diplomatic alliances and dynastic considerations. Her father was furious, but there was little he could do. Stephanie was nearly 35 years old, a widow, living in Vienna on a Habsburg pension. She was beyond his direct control, and then in the late 1890s, Stephanie found love again. Count Elémir Longye was a Hungarian aristocrat, cultured, intelligent, kind. More importantly, he genuinely cared for Stephanie as a person, not as a political commodity or breeding stock. For the first time in her life, Stephanie experienced a relationship based on mutual affection and respect, rather than duty and arrangement. It must have felt like a revelation. Elémir even converted from Protestantism to Roman Catholicism, hoping to win King Leopold's approval for the marriage. It was a significant sacrifice. Religion mattered deeply in that era, and conversion wasn't undertaken lightly. It didn't work. In a fierce letter that Stephanie preserved for the rest of her life, King Leopold II flatly refused to sanction the marriage. His daughter, a princess of Belgium and widow of the Crown Prince of Austria, could not marry a mere Hungarian count. It was beneath her station. It would embarrass the Belgian royal family. He forbade it, absolutely. But Stephanie had spent her entire life being told what to do. She had been married off as a teenager to a man who destroyed her body and her future. She had been trapped in Vienna, isolated and mourning. She had lost everyone she loved to death and betrayal, and she was done obeying. On March 22, 1900, 35-year-old Stephanie married Elémir Longye at Miramarais Castle near Trieste on the Adriatic coast. It was a small private ceremony, nothing like the grand spectacle of her first wedding. By marrying without her father's consent and without the permission of the Habsburg court, Stephanie lost all her imperial titles. She was no longer an archduchess, no longer Her Imperial Highness, no longer the Dowager Crown Princess of Austria. She became simply Countess Longye. For the first time in her life, Stephanie had made her own choice, put her own happiness first. And and she paid the price for it. Titles, status, family approval, all gone. But she gained something too. A partner who loved her. A companion who chose her freely as she chose him. It was a trade-off. And for once, Stephanie decided it was worth it. The family disputes didn't end with Stephanie's remarriage. If anything, they intensified. Back in Belgium, King Leopold II was growing old. He had no surviving male heirs. His son had died in childhood, and he only had daughters. Plans were made for his nephew, Prince Albert, to succeed him as King Albert I after Leopold's death. But Leopold had long been furious with his daughters for what he saw as their betrayals. Louise had married a German prince without his full approval. Stephanie had defied him entirely by marrying Elémère. His resentment ran so deep that when Marie Henriette, his estranged wife and the girl's mother, died in 1902, Leopold forbade Stephanie from attending the funeral. Imagine that, being forbidden from mourning your own mother because your father was too proud and too bitter to let his grievances go even in death. Leopold refused to see Stephanie again. When he was dying in 1909, she tried to visit him one last time. He turned her away. He died without ever reconciling with his daughter. His final act of cruelty toward the child he had once used as a political pawn. But the cruelty didn't end there. After Leopold's death, Stephanie and her sisters discovered something shocking. Despite their father's immense wealth built on Congolese suffering, remember, he had left them almost nothing in his will. Instead, he had left the bulk of his fortune to Caroline Lacroix, his much younger mistress, whom he had secretly married just 5 days before his death. Caroline, a former prostitute whom Leopold had kept as his companion for years, inherited palaces, estates, and a vast fortune. His daughters, legitimate princesses of Belgium, were left with a pittance. Enraged and humiliated, Stephanie and her sisters launched a fierce legal battle that dragged on for 5 years. They argued that their father's deathbed marriage was invalid, that Caroline had manipulated a sick, dying man, that as his legitimate children they deserved their rightful inheritance. Eventually, they reached a settlement. Stephanie received 5 million francs, a substantial sum certainly, but a fraction of what should have been hers as the daughter of one of Europe's wealthiest monarchs. It was one final indignity from a father who had never truly loved her, who had seen her only as a tool to be used and then discarded. For a while, life was almost peaceful, but the world around them was about to explode. In the summer of 1914, while on a state visit to Sarajevo in Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man Stephanie's father had once wanted her to marry, was assassinated by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Franz Ferdinand's death triggered a diplomatic crisis that spiraled out of control within weeks. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia refused. Austria declared war. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany supported Austria. France and Britain joined the opposite side. By August 1914, Europe was at war, the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I. Just weeks after the war began, Germany invaded Belgium, despite its declared neutrality. For the next 4 years, Stephanie's homeland remained under brutal German occupation. Cities were destroyed. Civilians were killed. Belgium suffered tremendously. And Stephanie? She was living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was allied with Germany, allied with the nation occupying her homeland. It must have been a strange, painful position. She had never felt fully Belgian. Her father had rejected her. The Belgian people barely knew her. But it was still her birthplace, her heritage. And now her adopted country was at war with her homeland. By then, Stephanie and Elamir had settled permanently at their mansion, which was far enough from the front lines that they were spared the worst of the fighting, at least initially. There, Stephanie dedicated herself to charitable work, organizing aid for wounded soldiers, supporting orphans and widows, doing what she could to alleviate suffering in a world tearing itself apart. She had spent her life surviving tragedy and loss. Now she tried to help others do the same. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in November 1916, Stephanie and Elamir returned to Vienna for his funeral and the coronation of his successor. It was the first time Stephanie had been back to the imperial capital in years. The city had changed. The empire was crumbling under the weight of war. The once grand palaces looked shabby and neglected. Food was scarce. The population was exhausted. 2 months after the funeral, in January 1917, Elamir was elevated to the rank of prince within the Hungarian aristocracy. Stephanie, who had lost her imperial titles 17 years earlier, became a princess again, though of a very different rank than she had once held. But titles meant little as the world collapsed around them. In October 1918, Austria-Hungary lost the war. More than that, the empire itself collapsed, fragmenting into separate nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and more. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was exiled. Most Habsburg royals fled into exile across Europe, but Stephanie and Elamir were spared. Because Elamir was Hungarian and had kept his distance from the Habsburg court, they were allowed to remain at their mansion. The world had changed unrecognizably. Empires had fallen. Millions were dead. The old order was gone forever. But Stephanie survived, as she always did. At least now she had found some measure of happiness with Elamir. After all the betrayal and loss, she had a partner who truly cared for her, who stood by her through everything. By this time, Stephanie was also a grandmother. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, had married and given birth to several children in the early 1900s. For a while, Stephanie enjoyed visits with her grandchildren, finding joy in their innocence and energy. During these final decades, Stephanie composed her memoirs. They were published in French in 1935 and translated into English in 1937 under the title, I Was to Be Empress. But it wasn't a full autobiography. It wasn't a comprehensive account of her 81 years of life. Instead, the book focused almost entirely on her early years and her marriage to Rudolf. She barely mentioned the half-century that followed Rudolf's death, the 56 years of widowhood, remarriage, world wars, and loss. The book was divided into 4 parts, with the final section titled simply Tragedy at Mayerling. It was clear that her story, at least the one she chose to tell the world, ended in 1889 when she was just 24 years old. The infected princess lived through it all. But at what cost? She lost her health, her fertility, her status, her family. She spent decades in pain, both physical and emotional. She died in exile in a monastery far from the glittering courts where she had once been celebrated. Or perhaps, just perhaps, in those final 20 years with Elamir, away from courts and politics and duty, Stephanie found something that had eluded her for most of her life. Peace. Not happiness maybe, not joy, but peace. The quiet acceptance of a life that had been far harder than it should have been, but which she had survived nonetheless. We'll never know for certain. She kept those years private, locked away behind silence. But I truly hope, that somewhere in those quiet decades, the infected princess finally found a measure of the peace she had been denied for so long. If you found this story as fascinating and heartbreaking as I did, please leave a like. and subscribe for more forgotten royal histories. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Stephanie ever found true peace? Or did the trauma of her early life haunt her until the end? Was her survival a victory or just prolonged suffering? And here's a harder question. How many Princess Stephanies are there in history whose stories we'll never know? Women used, betrayed, and discarded by the very systems that were supposed to protect them? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.